Everyone knows the flood, the ark, the animals, the dove, the rainbow. But there is one detail that almost no summary mentions. Noah and his family were locked inside that hull for 371 days. They were not tourists on a cruise. They were 8 human beings responsible for the survival of every animal species on Earth. That changes everything about the way you picture that story. When you first hear Noah's Ark, the image that comes to mind is almost always the same. A colorful toy boat with a giraffe stretching its neck over the side. An elephant here, a lion there, calm waters, and a friendly rainbow in the background. It is the infantilized version of an event that, once you start calculating the real numbers, quickly stops being a bedtime story and becomes one of the most brutal logistical challenges ever recorded in any text from antiquity. And the most unsettling part is not the scale of the construction nor the number of animals. It is the time, 371 days. More than a full year inside a closed wooden structure with no way of knowing whether the world outside still existed. To understand what it was like to live in that space, you first need to understand what that space actually was. The text of Genesis in chapter 6, verses 15 and 16 provides the dimensions with surprising precision. The ark was to be 300 cubits in length, 50 in width, and 30 in height. A Hebrew cubit was equivalent to approximately 45 centimeters, which turns those measurements into something concrete and verifiable. 135 meters in length, just over 22 meters in width, and just over 13 meters in height. 3 floors, a single window described as being 50 centimeters high, running along the top of the hull. A single side door. Put that into a scale you can actually visualize. 135 meters is longer than an official soccer field, which averages around 105 meters. The ark was longer. In width, it was comparable to 6 lanes of a highway, and with 3 internal floors, the total living area came to around 8,300 square meters of habitable surface. That sounds like a lot, until you divide that space among 8 humans, tons of food, water reservoirs, and a number of animals that researchers still debate with intensity. The text specifies the material gopher wood. Most scholars identify this term with cypress, a wood known for its water resistance and structural durability used in Mediterranean shipbuilding for millennia. The entire structure was to be coated with pitch inside and out, which in practice means that Noah and his sons spent years applying a waterproofing layer to every centimeter of the wooden surface, internally and externally, to ensure that the hull would not absorb water and would not rot during the time it would spend submerged or floating. The construction itself is a separate chapter. The text of Genesis does not record how long it took, but Jewish tradition and calculations based on the narrative suggest it may have taken between 50 and 100 years. Noah was 600 years old when the flood began. According to Genesis 7, verse 6, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, appear as married adults at the time of boarding. The construction likely began when they were still young or children. That means an entire generation's formative years unfolded while their father hammered cypress planks together in a region that had very probably never seen a real ship. Imagine what the neighbors must have thought. The text of Genesis does not describe the reactions of other people, but the Apostle Peter, in the 2nd chapter of his 2nd letter, calls Noah a preacher of righteousness, suggesting that he did not build in silence. He spoke, and people listened and went on with their lives normally, as Jesus himself mentions in Matthew 24, verses 37 and 38, describing that time. They ate, they drank, they married, until the day Noah entered the ark. Decades of construction, decades of warning, and not a single other human being boarded beyond the 8 members of his family. That alone says something about the weight those 8 people carried into that hull. It was not just the logistical responsibility of feeding and preserving the animal species. It was the awareness that out there, in the world being erased by water, there were neighbors, acquaintances, perhaps friends from generations past who had chosen not to enter, and the door closed from the outside. But the construction is not the subject that will hold you here. What no one calculates properly is what happened after the door closed. Genesis 7 verse 11 dates the beginning of the flood. The second month, the 17th day of the 600th year of Noah's life, the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of heaven were opened. For 40 days and 40 nights the rain did not stop. But the text continues beyond those 40 days. The waters increased and prevailed over the earth for 150 days, according to Genesis 7 verse 24. After that, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. After that, the waters continued to recede gradually. Noah opened the window and released the raven. Then the dove. First time, the dove came back. Second time, it returned with an olive branch. Third time, it did not come back. And even then Noah waited. And the text of Genesis 8 verse 14 records the date of the exit, the second month, the 27th day of the following year. When you calculate the difference between entry and exit, you arrive at 371 days, more than a year. And during that time, the work never stopped for a single day. Think about the logistics of feeding that many animals. Researchers disagree on how many species or kinds were on board. The Hebrew text uses the word min, which translates as species or genus, but which likely indicates a broader category than the modern concept of biological species. John Woodmarapp, a researcher who carried out the most detailed published calculation on this subject, estimated that the ark could have housed around 16,000 animals, counting pairs of each basic type of terrestrial and flying vertebrate. Other scholars arrive at smaller numbers, around 8,000 pairs, depending on how the taxonomic criterion is defined. But even in the smallest scenario, we are talking about tens of thousands of mouths to feed every day for 371 consecutive days with no external source of replenishment. The text specifies that Noah was to take on board enough food for himself, for his family, and for all the animals. Genesis 6 verse 21. The calculation of the food provisions needed to sustain that number of animals for a year is staggering. The estimated total daily food consumption for 16,000 animals, considering the average size and metabolic needs of each type, would be considerable for the large animals alone. Here, researchers like Woodmarapp propose that the animal composition of the ark would be predominantly small to medium-sized animals, which would make the daily consumption significantly smaller. The average size of terrestrial vertebrates is far smaller than the elephant or the giraffe would suggest. Most land animals are roughly the size of a domestic sheep or smaller. This is fundamental for understanding the viability of the project. If you picture the ark filled with elephants, giraffes, and hippos, the calculation seems impossible. If you understand that terrestrial biodiversity is numerically dominated by small animals, rats, rabbits, lizards, birds, insects, small mammals of all kinds, the proportions shift completely. Large animals are the visual exception, not the numerical rule. And inside a vessel with 8,300 square meters spread over 3 floors, the accommodation capacity for small and medium-sized animals is far greater than the popular image of an ark packed with giant animals suggests. But even reducing the scale, the work of distributing food to tens of thousands of animals, twice a day for more than a year, carried out by 8 people, is an operation that allows not a single moment of rest. 8 people. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and the wife of each one. That means each adult would be responsible for feeding, hydrating, and caring for something in the range of 2,000 animals per person, every day, without exception. And this is where the problem that no one mentions when telling this story to children comes in. The waste. A single adult cow produces around 25 to 30 kilograms of manure per day. A single horse between 15 and 20 kilograms. A single elephant between 150 and 200 kilograms per day. If you have just one pair of each of those large animals, you are already accumulating hundreds of kilograms of organic material per day from just 3 species. Multiply that by dozens or hundreds of different species, factor in the birds, the reptiles, the insects that were likely on board, and you are looking at a quantity of waste that without an efficient disposal system would have rendered the internal environment of the ark uninhabitable within days, not months. The biblical text does not describe the waste disposal system, but the construction logic of the ark suggests possible solutions. The hull had 3 floors. The structure was inclined from the sides toward the center, which some researchers interpret as an internal drainage system that would direct liquid waste toward the center and eventually out of the hull. Others propose that the animals were kept on wooden gratings spaced wide enough for waste to fall through into compartments below. This is precisely the system used on farms and livestock transport ships for millennia afterward. Slatted floors that separate the animal from its own waste, reducing infection and discomfort. The problem is that someone still had to clean those compartments periodically, and that someone was the same 8 people already feeding tens of thousands of mouths per day. The smell inside the ark was part of the daily reality of those 8 people in a way that no children's illustration captures. Ammonia from fermented waste, constant humidity from a hull surrounded by water on all sides, the heat generated by the breathing and metabolism of tens of thousands of animals in a confined space, the decomposition of any food left unconsumed before it spoiled, and over all of that, the near total absence of ventilation, except for the 50-centimeter window described in the text. That window is a point of debate. The Hebrew uses the word tsohar, which some translate as window and others as opening for light, or even as a transparent roof made of some crystalline material. If it was a continuous opening running along the entire upper perimeter of the hull, as a literal reading of the text suggests, then the ventilation would have been significantly better than a single window implies. But even so, air circulation within 3 enclosed floors, carrying the live cargo that vessel held, was an engineering challenge the builders would have had to consider during the planning stage. Darkness was another element that you rarely stop to imagine. For much of the 371 days, the only light available inside the ark would have been what came through the upper window. On the lower floors, the dimness would have been almost total. Working, feeding animals, and cleaning compartments in the semi-darkness of a sealed hull for months on end is the kind of effort that affects not just the body, but the mind. And for Noah and his family, there was no visible guarantee of when it would all end. The text records that God spoke to Noah before the flood and promised to establish his covenant with him. But inside the ark, with no window to the horizon, with no visibility of the outside world, that promise had to be sustained by faith in absolute silence. The psychological pressure of not knowing what was happening outside was constant and unrelenting. For the first 40 days, the rain did not stop. That much they knew, because they could hear it. But from the moment the rain ceased and the ark floated in relative silence over an ocean that covered everything they had ever known, the uncertainty became the heaviest burden to carry. Where were they? How deep was the water? Was there anywhere to land? How much longer? None of those questions could be answered from inside the hull. The only point of reference was the promise they had received before they entered. 40 days of intense rain. Think about what that means acoustically inside a wooden hull. Rain beating against the wooden deck for 40 consecutive days would have produced a continuous, deafening noise. The sound of water rising along the sides of the hull, the noise of a wooden structure that was never designed for the open sea, adjusting its rigidity under the pressure of buoyancy, creaking, cracking, the groan of timber under load. For the animals, accustomed to silence or to the natural sounds of their environment, this permanent acoustic bombardment would have been a constant source of stress. For Noah and his family, it was the soundtrack of each day, waking up without knowing whether the wood would hold for another hour. The question of buoyancy is technically relevant. A vessel with the Ark's dimensions would have had a considerable displacement capacity. Modern naval engineering studies using the biblical proportions indicate that the Ark would have had exceptional stability against waves and water movement, with a ratio between length, width, and height that is remarkably close to the standards used in modern ships. The 6-to-1 ratio between length and width is virtually identical to the ratio used in the construction of large cargo vessels today. This is not a coincidence that scholars overlook. It is one of the most frequently cited technical arguments in favor of the structural viability of the biblical description. But structural viability does not solve the problem of fresh water. Tens of thousands of animals need fresh water, not seawater, and the Ark was surrounded by water in every direction, but none of it would have been suitable for direct consumption. The flood in Genesis is described as a combination of rain coming from above and the fountains of the great deep that burst open from below, which may indicate the rising of underground aquifers in addition to rainfall. That means the floodwaters were likely not salt water in the strict sense, but a mixture of fresh water and sediment that would have made direct collection problematic, but not impossible. One reasonable hypothesis is that rainwater collection systems through the roof or the upper window would have supplied part of the necessary water. The volume of rain over 40 continuous days would certainly have been sufficient to fill large internal reservoirs. Storing food for more than a year under conditions of high humidity and heat generated by the animals creates another problem: deterioration. Most grains, if stored properly in sealed containers, can last 1 to 2 years without significant loss of nutritional value. Dried seeds, flours, dehydrated legumes, these are the most logistically efficient foods for a long-term storage situation. Fresh fruits and vegetables would not have lasted more than a few weeks. Hay for the herbivores would have needed to be extremely dry to avoid fermenting. Meat, if used for the carnivores, would have required some method of preservation, such as drying, salting, or smoking. All of this needed to have been planned, prepared, and loaded before the door closed. Genesis 6, verse 22, records a sentence that is easy to read past without registering the weight it carries. And Noah did, according to all that God commanded him, so he did. That includes the complete logistical planning of more than a year's worth of supplies for one of the largest live cargoes ever gathered in a single enclosed space. The preparation was not improvised, it was calculated. Now consider the behavior of the animals. A pair of lions sharing space with a pair of deer in a confined, stressed and dark environment is a recipe for immediate carnage, not peaceful coexistence. The text of Genesis does not describe how the animals were kept separated, but the construction logic indicates that the Ark must have had partitions, individual or group compartments per species, and some system of isolation between predators and prey. The alternative, letting all of them share a common space, simply would not have worked for any meaningful length of time. Researchers who have studied the logistics of the Ark propose that the animals may have entered some state of reduced metabolism during the voyage, a state similar to hibernation or torpor, which occurs naturally in many vertebrate species when exposed to conditions of stress, food scarcity, or sudden changes in atmospheric pressure. This biological mechanism would have dramatically reduced the need for feeding, the production of waste, and the level of agitation among the animals. If valid, this hypothesis would mathematically resolve some of the most difficult logistical problems to reconcile with the biblical narrative. The text neither confirms nor denies this possibility. What the text does confirm is that at the end of the 150 days during which the water prevailed over the earth, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. It was not land. It was the tip of a mountain emerging from the surface of the water. The text says the mountains only became visible 40 days after the landing at Ararat. Then Noah waited 7 more days before releasing the raven, 7 more before releasing the dove for the first time, 7 more before the second time when it returned with the olive branch, 7 more before the third time when it did not return. And even after all of that, when he removed the covering of the roof and saw that the surface of the ground was dry, he still waited until God ordered the exit. No impulse, no rush. 371 days, and Noah still waited for the command. That is a detail of character that the text records without commentary. After more than a year confined, with 8 people and tens of thousands of animals, with all the physical and psychological effort that entailed, with the hull finally at rest and the dry ground visible, and Noah waited. The opening and the departure came through the command, not through the impulse of anticipation. Genesis 8 verses 15 through 18. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds, cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. The first thing the text records after the exit is that Noah built an altar and offered burnt offerings. After more than a year of brutally demanding physical labor, the first documented action was worship. Only after that did God formalize the covenant with the rainbow in the sky as recorded in the 9th chapter of Genesis. The rainbow that today appears in every infantilized version of the story is within the narrative context, the final outcome of 371 days of uninterrupted work, fear, faith, smell, darkness, and physical effort that those 8 people never described in writing, at least not in any text that has reached us today. What did reach us is the Genesis narrative. And the Genesis narrative is remarkably sober. It does not describe the fear. It does not describe the backaches of those who fed tens of thousands of mouths for more than a year. It does not describe what they felt when they heard the door closing from the outside, as Genesis 7 verse 16 records, "And the Lord shut him in." The door was closed by a force that was not human. What was inside was their responsibility. What was outside was the responsibility of something infinitely greater. That sobriety of the Hebrew text is itself a piece of data. Cultures that invent stories tend to embellish with dramatic details, dialogues, moments of heroism, and vivid descriptions of emotion. The text of Genesis is dry. Precise dates, precise measurements, lists. The aridness of the record is, paradoxically, one of the arguments scholars cite in favor of its seriousness as a historical document. The world Noah found outside the ark after 371 days was unrecognizable. There were no cities. There were no neighbors. There were no roads, markets, structure, or reference points. The landscape was blanketed in sediment deposited by the receding water, fallen trees, upturned soil, valleys reshaped by the force of the water that had passed through. 8 people and an ark full of animals in a world that needed to be rebuilt from zero. Geology records something that creationists and some conventional geologists debate intensely. The layered sedimentary formations around the planet, containing fossils of marine organisms at the tops of mountain ranges thousands of meters above sea level, suggest that water of extraordinary extent and depth covered regions that are today dry land. Mount Everest in the Himalayas contains fossils of marine creatures in its highest strata. The Andes have beds of fossilized oysters at over 4,000 meters of altitude. The Tibetan Plateau holds evidence of aquatic coverage at times that conventional geological models attribute to continental-scale events. This does not prove the biblical flood, but it is also not ignored by researchers who study the subject without a predetermined agenda. And here enters the data point that no technical discussion of the logistical viability of the Ark can afford to ignore. Archaeologists, geologists, and historians still debate coordinates, dates, and sediment strata. But there is one piece of data that cuts across the entire technical discussion. More than 200 different cultures on continents that never had contact with one another preserve in their collective memory the story of a global flood, a boat, and a survivor. From Mesopotamia to Mexico, from Greece to China, from India to Polynesia, the pattern repeats with variations in name and detail, but with the same core. The water covered everything, and someone survived to tell the tale. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in the 19th century in Mesopotamia and dated to at least 2,000 years before Christ, describes a flood sent by the gods, a chosen man instructed to build a boat, the boarding of animals, the cessation of the rains, the release of birds to check for dry land and landing on a mountain. The similarities to the Hebrew text are so specific that they generated decades of academic debate about which came first, which depended on the other, or whether both depended on an even older source that both preserved in distinct forms. The Hindu text of the Matsya Purana describes Manu, the first man, warned by a divine fish of a great flood, instructed to build a boat, and saved while all of humanity perished in the waters. In the Greek tradition, Deucalion receives the warning from Zeus and builds an ark, survives a flood of 9 days and nights, and lands on Mount Parnassus. The Tupinamba people of Brazil preserve a narrative of destruction by water, from which only 2 brothers survived in a tall tree. The Inca tradition records a flood from which only 1 couple survived on a hilltop. The Chinese have the myth of Gunyu, a catastrophic inundation of global proportions. The Polynesians have Tauroa, the creator who grew angry and drowned the world. More than 200 narratives, 200 different peoples on every inhabited continent on the planet, with the same core: water, destruction, boat, survivor. No communication network connected Mesopotamia to Polynesia 6,000 years ago. No ship crossed the Atlantic to carry the Hebrew story to the Tupinamba. No trade route connected China to Mexico before Columbus. And yet, the narrative pattern is the same. Noah's Ark can be discussed as theology, as myth, or as historical event. What cannot be dismissed is that something happened. Something large enough that the memory of 8 survivors still echoes in 200 different languages millennia later.